my name's Ben Eady, and I'm Online Media Manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Use Cases and User Stories for Agile Requirements. Today's featured speaker is Peter Schmidt from ESI International, and the webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd like to say thank you to ESI International for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Peter to get us started.
Ben, hello everyone. As Ben mentioned, my name is Peter Schmidt, and I hope you are having a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night in whatever time zone you might be listening from today. Today's presentation covers the use cases and user stories for Agile requirements. By way of introduction, I would just like to say that Agile is obviously an area that's of interest to more and more people. There was a recent Gartner survey that indicated that probably as much as 80% of software development within the next few years is going to be made using Agile methods. And so clearly this is an area which for business analysts and other members of potential members of Agile teams, we are all very interested in understanding what role can we play. What can we expect to see in terms of requirements and the role of the BA? How will requirements and the job of the BA change in the coming years as we shift more to Agile methods? What things do we currently have or use, or skills or approaches that we can make use of and leverage even in an Agile development environment? And all of these are questions that are quite relevant. So let's take a look at some of that, and I hope we can answer the questions for you to some extent today. We're going to cover three main areas of the agenda. Number one, the principles of requirements under Agile approaches. Secondly, setting the stage for requirements in Agile. And thirdly, the levels of Agile requirements, because there is something of a hierarchy that may be of interest to you to understand as we look at Agile projects and software development. Agile requirements principles give us a bit of a framework for understanding what are the underlying approaches that we're going to be taking for requirements gathering. One of the key, the first one, is to take a look at developing a process at the team level, at the project team level, that will serve as a mechanism for collaborative requirements gathering. And this is a key aspect of the team formation and the approach to the project. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we look at project visioning. But think of that as one of those internal processes that a team has to develop up front. The input from product owners and knowledgeable subject matter experts is another key aspect of requirements gathering, or principle under Agile. The use of facilitation, elicitation, and visual modeling skills. This should be nothing new for those of you who have backgrounds in business analysis, but it's as important, if not more important, under Agile than under a traditional approach to projects. In terms of the requirements, another key element is understanding that you are going to focus on the breadth of the project's requirements early and then focus on depth later. So from a business analyst and a requirements gathering perspective, we're going to try to understand the entirety of the requirements initially, and then at the appropriate time in the iterative approach, we're going to drill down to the level of detail that's needed. And that leads us actually to the next principle, which is that we will break down and slice requirements to the right level. So this is something of an apportioning exercise, which we'll examine in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. Likewise, acceptance testing, which under a traditional approach to software development within a software development lifecycle, is often built as a phase which follows software development. In the case of an Agile project, where we are really dealing in very short iterative slices across the breadth of the project, acceptance testing becomes a part of the requirements defined at the level of the iteration itself. And then lastly, keeping just enough detail in the requirements as defined in the user story, which is the term we will use for the level of requirement that we're dealing with here, dealing in just enough detail to get to the next step is rather key. So overbuilding of requirements is not an area, is definitely not in the cards as one of the principles for Agile requirements. Let's build on this a little bit more and look at some of the characteristics around Agile requirements. Some of these harmoniously relate to the slide we looked at a moment ago, but number one, just-in-time detail. We are really looking at the characteristic of a project that's going to be built around time boxing the delivery into very tight iterative cycles. Therefore, the level of detail that's needed has to be developed just in time and has to be very light. So the level of detail will be necessarily less than probably what we're used to under a traditional requirements definition phase of a standard project. Agile also assumes that changes will happen in requirements throughout the life of the project. Therefore, we work with an assumption up front that requirements will change, and that will be through design or through realization or the solution of certain technical issues throughout the development of the project. Requirements will never be sealed, and therefore they can be reopened. So a requirement that was developed under an iteration 4 weeks previously can be moved back into the workflow for additional build-out or clarification if it's appropriate to do so in an Agile project. Project requirements, as in user stories, are estimated in story points. This is somewhat different than the traditional approach to requirements gathering. We'll touch on story points a little bit more as we go forward. But it's a very, very simple way of allowing a project team to look at and compare requirements side by side in terms of prioritizing. Which leads us actually to number 6. Requirements can be prioritized top-down. The backlog of user stories in an Agile project effectively represents a prioritization of the requirements. We're going to be taking a shorter time to gather these requirements. There is one product owner involved in the project itself. The product owner is representative of the end customer for the software product that's in development. We talked about this a bit earlier, the focus on breadth, understand the entirety of the requirements in their breadth rather than in depth before launching. This is a little bit counterintuitive for those of us who come from traditional backgrounds. And lastly, requirements will be gathered collaboratively. The project team itself, some 5 to 9 people in a typical Agile software project team, will be working together as a team to gather requirements. And we'll see a little bit later in the presentation what role a business analyst in that team and what great value they can add to that process of collaborative requirements gathering. So I have a poll here for the attendees, the listeners on the line. What are the challenges that you feel you face on your project team or inside your organization when it comes to writing good requirements? Do you have difficulty in thinking about breadth than depth? Do you have some difficulty in breaking requirements into smaller, more manageable chunks which correspond to iterations? Is collaboration an issue within your project team? Or do you not follow INVEST, that is, applying requirements attributes of independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable to your requirements? So take a minute here and let's gather that. We're going to be opening the polling tool and let's see what the results come back with. Meantime, Andy Wall has asked a question regarding, do I feel that the focus on breadth of requirements is needed ahead of an iteration? And is this the head start that a BA potentially needs in order to focus on the appropriate level of depth and to help lead a team to that level of depth when they are ready to start an iteration? The short answer to that is yes, and I think we're actually going to be taking a look at that in a little bit more detail somewhat further in the presentation. So thank you for that question, Andy. Do we have some results to show?
Yes, we do. What we have here is actually almost a three-way spread between think breadth then depth, break it down into small chunks, and collaboration all have very close to 30%, and follow invest is sitting at about 15%.
And that may be because we're going to describe the invest attributes here in a little bit more detail, so that may not be quite as well understood by everyone. So if we're broken three ways across the first 3 points, that is breadth and depth, breaking into chunks and collaboration, that's probably pretty typical. So these are areas which typically give organizations difficulty in Agile software development, and it's not that unusual. If I can move on, let's take a look at the next slide. Requirements and writing good requirements in a little bit more detail. So we've discussed previously that this should be done collaboratively, and I think I touched on it, that this is in effect a team activity. So the role of the BA previously is something of a specialist who worked as a facilitator to gather requirements from the business users and others. This role is actually filled now by a team, but that is requirements. If it can be defined at a high level, it can then be shaved down or broken up into smaller bits if it's too broad a reach. But the key is to start with breadth rather than depth. You can imagine the difficulties if it were to be done the other way around. The third one, follow the you invest attributes. Let's talk about those for just a second. The you really can be representative of understandable. So if you think of this as follow understandable attributes, with invest being a mnemonic that represents I for independent. That is, the attribute of a good requirement is that it should be independent. It can stand alone as a user story that can be examined in isolation. It should be negotiable, or in other words, have been developed facilitatively and collaboratively, but is still open for negotiation even right until final release. V stands for value. That is, it should provide business value for the customer or the recipient of the software product. This is an element that many times we've lost sight of that on traditional projects, that the value is ultimately to the end customer. So we keep that in mind right from the get-go here as we think about requirements. E and invest for estimatable. So if we cannot actually sink our teeth into a defined requirement, defined user story, and actually be able to provide some estimate around the level of effort or labor required to build it, then it doesn't really represent a good requirement. And it might require us, or it may be necessary for us to step back from it and redefine it in a little bit tighter terms so that we can get to that level of estimation. S in invest represents small, and we're deliberately taking requirements small because we are working in iterations that represent short periods of time. An underlying tenet of the Agile software development approach is the idea of a fixed time iteration that could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months in length, but we time box our software build to include all elements of the requirements gathering and build, test, and release into a, let's say, a test environment. Takes place within that time box space. So we have to make sure the requirements are small enough for us to be able to successfully fulfill within that fixed time period. And then lastly, testable, which probably resonates with most of the audience here. If a requirement can't actually be tested, it really can't be considered as a good requirement. There has to be some mechanism that allows us to say yes or no, it can be accepted as having fulfilled the requirement. Breaking it down into small chunks, I think we've really described that in some detail here as we talk through invest. And the last one is an interesting point. Stories, user stories, do not equate to tasks. I'm going to leave that one at that because we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in one of the upcoming slides. You'll hear a great deal of talk in the Agile space around visioning, project visioning, and the need to conduct retrospectives and revisionings periodically throughout the project. A pattern that you will find throughout the execution of an Agile software development build is this idea of iterative loops. So right from the outset, the project is considered an iteration in its own right, and it follows a very high-level cycle, which is basically laid out on this slide. We create a long-term vision for a project in that we will, as a team, come together to collaboratively describe what the project will look like in its future state, and something that's near and dear to the hearts of most business analysts, we'll be looking for patterns. The analyst is trained to be looking for patterns and relationships, But this applies as well to people and their relationships with the product as it does to elements within the architecture or within the requirements. So people relate to the requirements, as do the customer, and these patterns need to be examined throughout the duration of the project. Secondly, we're working on developing strategies for achieving the vision for the project. If we've defined or created that long-term vision, we can then look at focusing on attainable goals for the project, identifying the potential problems and risks, balancing opportunities and challenges. So what we're really describing here is something that will happen at the outset of a project team coming together, and then will periodically recur throughout the duration of the project when the team feels it's necessary to re-examine the vision, determine if it's still accurate or adequate, and then be revisiting it, as I said, throughout. And it can be revised based on feedback. So again, we're leaving requirements open, even at the visioning level, right through until the very end of the project and the delivery of its product. A word on project deliverables. Most of us come from traditional backgrounds where the phasing or the phase gating of a traditional project was often defined by the quality and caliber of the document-driven artifacts that were produced through the life of the project. In the Agile approach, we really are leading all of this out to the point where we will minimize documentation to represent what we see here on this slide. That first of all, you will have a set of documents that are considered working documents needed during the actual execution of the project. So these are the must-haves, the ones needed to guide you. And we'll look at this in a little bit more detail too in a coming slide. Secondly, there are going to be enterprise-level documents which represent artifacts needed after a software build, after the project's completion. These can be architectural documents and others. So we are going to need these as reference documents in the future. So the sum of these two represent the minimal documentation required. So the question is often asked, how much documentation is required in Agile? And the answer typically comes back as the absolute minimum needed to successfully deliver the project. So we talked about these project deliverables. This is a sample from an actual project that represents a project deliverables checklist. And this too is a document or a list of artifacts that's prepared by the team themselves in advance as they work their way through the formula I showed you on the preceding slide. So here we have a list of deliverables that are phased through the Agile phasing of the project. So you can see at the blue bar, project initiation represents a phase, release planning, iteration 0, which is typically a planning iteration at the outset of a project. And then in the development phase, we are grouping together a common set of deliverable documents that are used during every development iteration. So that could be iteration 1 through whatever number of iterations comprise the release. And then we have a pre-release phase and some needed documentation there. So you can see a number of documents listed in the checklist that are pretty typical of many projects you're currently working on. Some may be a little bit different than what you're used to. Someone earlier actually asked a question here via the automated tool about project financial planning. So as you can see, a project initiation, this comprises one aspect of a document or one document that's an agreed upon project deliverable for this particular sample that we're looking at. And in release planning, you will see the first of the documents that represent unique documentation requirements of Agile, story backlog, the release plan. EA documentation is probably more typical of traditional projects, but it's equally applicable here. And as a result, you see it included in this list. And in the development phase, you see a documentation list that represents some unique to Agile and some fairly standard. What I want you to take a look at, however, is that there is in fact a test log and a test plan that comprise every iteration's documentation. So we are building testing in at every iteration, and you'll recall what I mentioned earlier, that an iteration under Agile can be anywhere from a 2-week to a 2-month time-boxed release of a product. And so we are building the testing in right from the outset, and it comprises a critical piece of every iteration. Often when we're talking about Agile projects, the subject of tooling arises. And tooling under Agile can be anything from a corkboard, bulletin board that's used as a task planner through to automated tools that represent leading-edge capability for automated management of software development. But there are some questions that the project team or the organization needs to look at when it comes time to examine and agree upon tools. What functionality is needed? Which tools can help the team reach the goal? And what should be the criteria for selecting some of these tools? So mapping very closely to the project deliverables, the documentation checklist we looked at a couple of slides back, here's the same checklist effectively reworked to show what tools are required phase by phase. So similarly, the project team is using this checklist as a guide to indicate what tools will be used by the team throughout. And you'll see some here that are familiar, SharePoint, for example, the test environments, tools for mapping quality, and so on, enterprise repository and others. This shouldn't be unfamiliar to any of you who are working in software development. Let's step back from that for a second and look at the bigger picture of how do ideas regarding new products migrate from the idea stage or ideation phase through to actually being work conducted at the iteration level of an Agile software project. Now, keep in mind, or think of this as we go through it from the perspective of requirements and how the business analyst fits into this thing. An idea list typically is generated at a corporate level, at a strategic level, based on either strategic planning or customer feedback or a variety of other inputs that eventually work their way into proposed projects within a project portfolio. The theme that you're seeing emerge throughout this slide is this idea of prioritization, with the most important always working their way to the top of a list. And so these columns, it's the upper, in the case of the idea qualification phase, we're looking at the top 5 or so will migrate their way into becoming the top 5 projects. And of those top 3 projects or 2 projects, we are looking at Team A and Team B, or Project A and Project B, launching on the project level planning for 2 detailed projects. The blue boxes for each project represent the user stories. And the user stories are the series of red stripes that you see in the story backlog, which comprise, or also translate as you move over toward the right, into the elements of the releases. So the user stories are grouped into sprints, and you see sprint 1, 2, 3, etc. in the release plan. And the release plan comprises a grouping of a limited number of sprints. Again, it's time boxed. So the release, for example, if a sprint represents 2 weeks worth of work, we're looking at 2 weeks, some 10 weeks worth of work here for the release, the planned release. So we've time boxed the sprint to 2 weeks, and we've time boxed the release to 10 weeks. The sprint further decomposes at the level of the user story into an iteration work package or an iteration task list that we will look at in a little bit more detail here as we go forward. Let's look at the hierarchy of requirements as we consider them under an Agile approach. Agile would define a release as having a theme. So in this case, let's discuss a fictional or notional example of a website being developed by ModernAnalyst to assist business analysts post resumes and seek work. And so the theme of the release that's being built here, or that we're considering, is centered on a job seeker as the theme. The feature we're going to build, or the feature we're going to focus on, is going to be resume management at the level of the feature. That feature further decomposes into two stories, and the user story is the essential requirement definition under Agile. And we see the two of them here. As a job seeker, I wish to upload a resume. And then the second one, as a job seeker, I wish to delete my resume. So those represent two user stories. At the level of detail below the user story, we have two levels of technical detail here. So TC1, TC2 represent the technical components of it. In the first one, verify that only Word and PDF documents can be uploaded. And in the second one, verify that file size cannot exceed 80K. So you can see that that represents the detail underlying the story of, as a job seeker, I want to upload a resume. Let's take another poll here with the group who are listening. What level of Agile requirements development do you feel you or your project, your organization have the most challenges with? Is it at the level of the theme or the epic, that is at the release level, at the level of the feature, at the level of the user story, or at the level of the task, which is the subcomponent of the user story? Let's open that up to the audience and take a straw poll on that one.
Theme or epic, we have 19%, feature at 19%, user story at 42%, and task at 20%.
Okay, so the user story is the one we could perhaps answer a couple of questions on. I'm just taking a look through my question list here. I have one here from Joandra who asks, on their team, the Scrum Master has indicated they have a requirement which will last for the entire project development phase. Does that in fact fit with the small definition of the requirements attributes of invest? Does that in fact work? I think there are going to be requirements that will be threaded through each user story, and I think we've looked at a couple of examples of them, the most notable being the requirement for testing or the requirement for information security may be a common requirement that threads through. But while it represents a common requirement at one level, it's going to be unique to the technical development of the solution at the level of the user story, because the user story definition is for a fairly concise product of value that's being built during that iteration. I think that answers that question. I think we can move along here. I've got so many questions coming in here. It's actually going to be a challenge to try to address too many more. Let's look at requirements at the portfolio layer. And at the highest level of requirements, you recall the earlier slide showed the flow down of ideas to project portfolio, to selection within the portfolio of projects and the establishment of project teams, and then the further breakout of, at the level of the project team, of the releases and the user stories. So if we look at the highest level of requirements, if we look at the highest level of requirements, in Agile there are two high-level requirements, those of the themes and the epics. The epic at portfolio level are large-scale in nature, as you can see, and they demonstrate the vision. So this goes back a little bit to the visioning slide we examined earlier. They do not drill down into specificity. So it represents that second layer of abstraction. Theme, as we looked at on an earlier slide, might represent something fairly esoteric, like the job seeker. The epic, then, is defining what epics are managed typically by a portfolio group. So if there's a PMO within your organization that's looking at the intended strategic output of projects, these are the folks that are likely to give you this kind of assistance or guidance. While they're managed and maintained in the portfolio backlog, and you can see it here that investment themes are driving Epic 1, 2, and 3, the assignment of project teams to this, and then the development of the more detailed levels of requirements and the ultimate delivery of the product fall to a project team. There's another area of epics called architectural epics, which also exist at the portfolio level. And so most organizations today have an enterprise architecture construct of some kind that's helping to drive the infrastructure side of the initiatives. So the architectural epic in this, in this instance would represent the blending of possibly some waterfall approaches with Agile, but it's typically an enterprise architecture group that might be looking at this and trying to figure out what's the most effective approach for each element of the build-out. So if they're looking at it at a very macro level, it's quite conceivable that they may select projects to be run in conventional, traditional methods versus some that can be run in Agile methods. The problem domain, or the business challenge, is an area where most business analysts have a deep grounding in this area. So this is a little bit different under Agile from the traditional, in that in the traditional approach, the business analyst would spend a fair bit of time researching and getting under the skin of what's going on at the business unit level, where the customer is going to be receiving a capability or a software tool or some kind of a new system build. In this case, it's more important to identify the users and the stakeholders and to develop a collaborative arrangement with these folks, that the working level relationships are put in place for ongoing collaboration throughout the life of the project. This is an area where the BA, many of you on the phone here, bring a special set of skills to this, because you, in many cases, have been doing something like this already. The primary tools here will be interviews, shadowing, surveys, some market research, all of which are very well developed tools within the BA bag of tricks. So just a quick summary on the visioning and what we're doing. The visioning and the visioning effort prior to a project launch gives us that clear understanding of why are we doing this, what are the key objectives, how will we measure success, and this gives us that vision definition. Again, this slide will ring true for most BAs in the audience. If we look at the effort of requirements visioning as a process with inputs and outputs, our goal is to identify a list of major processes and high-level process steps for a system. It gives us a big picture, perhaps via user interface flow, who needs to be doing what and to whom. The outputs are fairly standard in terms of the BA tool set: use case diagrams, high-level process flows, user interface flow diagrams, and a backlog, which is a rather unique Agile approach, but you'll see translates very nicely into some of this terminology. The techniques that are being used here, again, are very, very common tools for the BA group. Facilitator-led visioning workshops, high-level modeling, team breakouts, information gathering via one-on-one or with small groups. So at the level of the project/program, we are developing features, and again, this revisits a little bit the terminology around requirements under Agile. What are the new things that a system will do for its users? How do we describe the benefits? And then that critical area in the middle, the missing middle, how do we bridge that gap between high-level business needs and software requirements? So the epic may define the problem or the opportunity. The solution is defined via a description of features, and then through iterative approaches, the decomposition into stories, and then even at the level below stories into individual daily work packages. So there's another view of much the same idea here, that at the high level we're defining a theme that is for the release. Then at a mid-level we're describing feature sets of a software product. On this slide we refer to 25 to 50 features, ensuring a broad view of the product vision. That's a rough rule of thumb that represents the number of features that could be built into an epic or release. This is a very, very loose definition that can be scaled based on, the time boxing approaches that are being used by the project team or the complexity of the product being developed. There are some challenges in prioritizing the features in the program backlog. In general, our customers want everything that's on the list. And based on the constraints that we impose on an Agile project, that is a fixed time and a fixed budget, there's going to be some limitation to what can be built. Often product managers who are representatives of the customer will try to avoid prioritizing the features, and in fact will try to pack them all in. Many of you are probably nodding your heads at this point because you've seen this time and again. So there's always a trade-off, and the quantification of value has to be made, and in some form or another, a collaborative approach to defining the most important and prioritizing those against the less important, stack ranking them, is going to have to happen. And then lastly, obviously, comparing certain features to one another can be pretty challenging. So sometimes that has to be moved up a notch and be defined in terms of business value, and the customer has to serve a role via the product owner or executives even in breaking the ties. We're going to drill down in a little bit more detail to what is a user story. And the attributes of a story are the same as what we just defined as attributes of a good requirement. And you can see the you invest mnemonic again. But the story, the user story in Agile, is most often described as a brief, simple requirement statement that is written from the perspective of a layperson user. The stories are typically documented and made visible. We'll get into that here in a little bit. And there should be some acceptance criteria defined from the outset for the user story. User stories have some characteristics, especially the great ones. They should be short and easy to read. They should be captured in a list format. This should not be a long, involved paragraph description. They're often discarded after implementation. They should represent a very, very small sliver or shaving of increment of functionality. So this thing should be able to stand on its own and provide some element of functionality. They should be relatively easy to estimate. This goes back to that you invest mnemonic and the ability to be estimatable. And we're not capturing detailed system behavior in a user story. We're capturing the value from the perspective of the customer side. So this is just a little bit different than what we may have used under a traditional approach. Often the user story is written out on something like an index card or a post-it note. And therefore, you're limited on quite deliberately to 2 to 3 sentences to describe the story. Often it's a conversation, or it's written as a conversation, and it may capture actual discussions which are held with between the project team, the development team, and the product owner or the customer. And again, that confirmation. We need something in there that can, in a binary way, prove that it is acceptable or not acceptable when it's implemented. It works or it does not work under the following conditions. Requirements writing workshops are something, again, that the BA brings some capability and skills to the table. The requirements writing workshop is an element of every iteration, every sprint during an Agile build. It should involve as many of the team members as possible, and it really is a brainstorming exercise with someone like a business analyst able to facilitate and add value to putting these to define them. It's usually done in a room with post-it notes, flip charts, markers. The photo is a snapshot of a fairly typical arrangement of post-it notes lined up and color-coded. The facilitator is key. And again, as the business analyst or possible business analyst on the team, this might potentially be a very good role for you. Don't forget that the meeting norms and the acceptable rules of behavior and the ability to get even the less communicative members of a team to produce and to contribute is a key element or is a key differentiator for a good facilitator. You can see also that depending on the project type, there may be a number of ways that user stories or the development of user stories could be facilitated. And here are 3 examples straight out of the BA approach to life: the user-focused use case diagrams, process diagramming, user interface diagrams. All of these are useful tools to help you shred down to the layer of detail needed to develop the user story. Let's take another straw poll. How many of you in your Agile projects have used any of these 4 approaches? I'm not sure I can include number 4 as an approach, but let's say, how does it stack up in terms of your approaches that you experience day to day on your projects? Let's open that up to the audience. John asks a question based on, I think, a slide that was 1 or 2 slides back. If a user story is discarded after implementation, how's the current state of the system and processes captured? John, I just ask you to think back to the documentation charts that I showed you earlier. What documentation was going to be coming out of a project? There are going to be aspects of it, the architectural diagrams and certain other key documents that are, if they're agreed upon, then the actual user story elements are also captured in that documentation process. So I wanted to reassure you that this does not mean that we walk off the project with no documentation regarding the end state of the system we've just built.
Okay, so the results are in, and we have user case modeling at 38%, process modeling at 47%, business information modeling at 4%, and none at 11%.
Is it, sorry, was it process modeling represented our most used techniques?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And process modeling, in fact, is a very, very effective one under Agile as well, in that this helps to facilitate the discussion with the customer. So I think we're pretty close on track with that. That's interesting. All right, let's talk about personas. So here's an element of the Agile project approach, which probably will ring true for many of you who are BAs. The persona is representative of a customer segment or a user of a future system. They're stand-ins. In Agile, we can actually have a lot of fun with this. We can actually build them out as cartoon characters or take an actual photograph of someone on the team and play it up a little bit here. But they become representative of the user in the various situations or scenarios that we're looking at in the user story. We give them characteristics, we give them needs, we give them, in their own way, little personalities as well that are perhaps stereotypical, but it can be representative of a user in certain situations. So let's come back to high-level use case diagrams. What are they? They're diagrams that demonstrate the actors and their goals. So those personas that we defined just a moment ago can be built into the use case diagram. In terms of high-level visioning, the use case diagram can be extremely effective. They can also be very useful at the level of identifying themes and features. That is, at a level somewhat above the development of the user stories. They can help us to communicate those simple visual representations of project scope. When we look at identifying user roles, this is going to require some classic BA-style research. We have to understand the domain. We have to understand some of the real users, what challenges they're faced with, what their expectations are. In some instances, we can perform surveys to identify these things. In other instances, we can brainstorm with both customers or the team to try to identify these more accurately. The more broadly we can reach out for a cross-section of users for this kind of an effort, the more successful we're going to be with this. When we feel we've got our arms around the as broad a set or cross-set or cross-section of these users and have them identified, we've assigned them the personas, these can be used to help prioritize target roles. And the use case diagram is something most of you are familiar with, so the diagram is still quite relevant at the level that we've just described. And let's think for a minute about what kinds of questions the Agile project team, perhaps facilitated by its business analyst, might be asking customers. And so you can see here some of the sample questions. What are you trying to achieve with a new business process, business system? Why, and why is this important? Who's involved? How are they involved? What do those individuals want? Would they agree? Would they not agree on an approach to the requirement? What's the vision for how this will work? What things can go wrong? Decisions. Why are you making them, and what are you assuming underlying those? So revisiting the levels of requirements, at the highest level in the Agile project, we are dealing with the theme. At the medium level, we've defined the feature, in this case feature 1 and feature 2, as the mid-level definition of requirements. At the small level, we've defined story, user story 1, user story 2. Notice that under feature 2, as we started to decompose it, we discovered that rather than something we could sink our teeth into at the level of a user story, we actually came up with an epic, something bigger than a story. So therefore, we're going to take that epic and decompose it further. It requires further definition. It needs to be chunked out into more manageable level user stories. So that's the action item under feature 2. For the feature 1 story sets, we can see story 2 breaking out into some detail. We've got business rules, we have acceptance tests, user interface prototypes, activity diagrams, and ultimately some tasks that will devolve from that story that represent the day-to-day work that our team will be doing. And that is at the level of detail. Let's take a look at an example of a theme to feature to story mapping. So at the theme, we're looking at the employee area. At the feature level, we're talking about managing jobs. And at the story level, we have identified 3 user stories. As an employer, I want to post a job so others can find it. As an employer, I want to modify a job posting so it is correct. And as an employer, I want to view a list of my open job postings so I can analyze them. And so we have the 3 stories defined. If we take that story 1, as an employer, I want to post a job so others can find it. We can actually develop acceptance criteria for that particular story, that user story. And these are developed up front as part of the requirements development. And you can read them here, UAT 1 through 6, and how those, for example, could be written up by an Agile development team. And bearing in mind, again, that this is a team effort to put these together. So while there may be a business analyst present on the Agile software team, they may not be doing this without consultation with the remainder of the team. While we looked at it from one perspective, from user acceptance tests, we can also turn that same user story. As an employer, I want to post a job so others can find it, and decompose it into a series of tasks which represent the day-to-day working activities of the project team. So number 1, for example, create a database table to store the job posting detail, and working our way down through 8 or others as needed. And this is the stuff of the daily huddle, the daily stand-up meeting of an Agile project team to determine what needs to be done today or over the next several days as you move your way through these tasks. The tasks are not managed as project-level tasks in a conventional sense, but are self-managed by the team. So let's look for a second at some of the elicitation techniques for gathering requirements under Agile. We talked about visioning and some of the approaches we could use for that. At the level of visioning, you can see interviews, surveys, user roles, personas, use case diagrams, process diagrams, UI flow, context diagrams. All of those, I think, are pretty well understood by the group listening here. The mechanisms by which we can do some of these things, the brainstorming approach is a primary one under Agile. Group brainstorming or facilitator-led call-out, creative use of Post-it notes in a room or on a bulletin board, breakouts, then reconverge, coming back with itemized solutions or itemized approaches, story mapping, silence sorting. I mean, all of these represent approaches for helping you ultimately to prioritize requirements and to assist you in moving forward with the most important. The breakdown and slicing, likewise, you've got some filters here which could be applied over the prioritized requirements to help you to, again, mash those into shape so that you've got a prioritized list going into the iteration, into the Scrum. And then at the sprint level, we're doing the deep dives to look at developing those requirements at the appropriate level of granular detail. So we've gone broad here first, and this illustrates really that in the end we're diving down into granular detail with the deep dive, which is done at the level of the user story. So we have acceptance tests developed, test scenarios, example tables, for instance, prototyping wireframes, business rules, activity diagrams, all of which are usable for elaborating on those requirements at the level of the user story. So many of you are probably wondering how to pull all of this stuff together into one single snapshot. So this very, very busy slide will actually be available as a download for you from Modern Analyst, I believe, in the next couple of days, and Ben will probably refer to that in closing comments. But we prepared this as a PDF diagram, which you can print out on a sheet of paper or a poster, but it gives you some ideas around some of the skills and some of the approaches, so it represents a little bit of a memory aid to cover some of the stuff that we've talked about. Most interesting for you probably is the high-level, medium, small, and detail-level descriptions of what are the appropriate definition of requirements in an Agile project, and help you to come to grips with that notion of breadth first, then go for depth on requirements. I'm going to try to answer one or two questions here, Ben. I think we have a little bit of time remaining before we have to cut off. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've got about 7 minutes or so, so you got enough for a couple questions for sure.
So let me see. I've got a very good list of questions here. Let me scroll through for a second. A couple of these are more administrative. Will slides be available? Yes, they're going to be posted along with that, that graphic that you saw earlier. And those will be available as, that'll be a PDF diagram that's available to you for download after the webinar. So that covers the graphic and the slides. Roger asks a question, if you take less time to gather requirements and focus more on breadth rather than depth, does this increase the risk of missing requirements or of clarity or lacking clarity at the project level? So I ask you to bear in mind that what we're looking at here is a vision for the project. So we've defined what the ultimate product output will be. We are working with time constraints, and one of the tenets of Agile is that we are going to be delivering a product of value to the customer within a finite period of time, and we need to be continuously delivering value. So in project terms, when we think of requirements under the traditional approach, we start with a comprehensive list of requirements, and we build to that list of requirements, and ultimately it's the budget and the schedule that will often slip in order to allow us to gather the entirety of the requirements and to build those out. We're taking a little bit of a different approach here in that what we're doing is we're slicing requirements off into discrete manageable chunks, and we're going to start building a flow of this developed functionality and pushing it out to the customer on an ongoing basis. At some point, however, we are going to hit the end of a budget or the end of a schedule, and our objective is to have usable functionality in the hands of the customer whenever that might be. So I guess the short answer, and I don't mean to make it sound trite, is you continue building so long as there is time and budget and demand from the customer till that project has moved to a point where done is done. And so some of this is a collaborative decision made with the customer, so there has to be that ongoing dialogue, and the customer has to be completely involved in that decision process also. It may well be that 3 to 4 iterations or sprints into an Agile project that might have been set up for 10 iterations, the customer determines that they've gotten what they wanted. You can collaboratively determine that the project is actually complete at that point. And I don't think, Roger, that you have to have any fear at that point that the customer doesn't feel that they're getting the requirements they asked for. Siddharth asks a question, our biggest challenge is to contain scope within a fixed time frame. Are there some recommendations or techniques to deal with this issue? Well, the question of scope really is a question of can we contain requirements? And again, with Agile, what we're saying is the idea of fixing requirements at the outset of the project, we really put that notion aside and say requirements are open and requirements change is open right up until the final days of the project. And we're actually encouraging the customer to continue giving us further additional requirements, all on the understanding that that same customer is going to help us prioritize how that fits into the existing backlog of work and requirements that we're dealing with, and help us to take something else off the table if it's not going to work. So there's a continuous, I guess, a cost-benefit or trade-off analysis going on throughout the life of the project. So we have to stop thinking of scope in terms of it being a fixed state, and that scope is in continuous motion. However, budget and schedule are the only fixed elements we're dealing with here. Another question from Manos. Is Agile and Scrum applicable to all types of projects? Well, the short answer to that, honestly, is probably not. There are certain types of projects that are going to be more amenable to an Agile approach. Generally, these are projects that are going to require some level of experimentation or development of a new product that doesn't exist currently. These projects are going to be involving a lot more hands-on experimentation in the search for the solution. So Agile methods work very, very well for these kinds of projects. Other types of projects that might involve systems that might be safety critical, for example, the development of a transportation system or an airliner, or the building of a replacement bridge, clearly are projects that need the full requirements developed ahead of time, because this is the only way they can be successfully delivered, because they have to be mapped in an ironclad way back against those requirements. It's a subject we could probably discuss for some hours at length, but project selection is in fact a subject.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Peter, for a very informative presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event. And I'd like to say one last thing, Peter, is that I've seen a ton of kudos come through here. So a lot of people seem to have really enjoyed your presentation, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew that.